Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Just as we saw in the text yesterday, First Peter chapter 3 really doesn't fit with the American worldview and the American way of life. But let's read it together and dig in. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that, when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. This is the word of the Lord. What we continue to see in this epistle is this idea of authority. We see it at the very end of the chapter, where we just said that all authorities, angels, and powers are subject to Jesus. So Jesus has all authority over heaven and earth, as we saw in the gospel account of Matthew right at the end. He says that to the disciples. We saw in chapter 2 the idea of the governing authority, and that we are to subject ourselves to them, even though in this case the governing authority was wicked and evil and was killing Christians. The Christian was still to be subject to them. And here, this chapter begins with the idea that wives would be subject to their husbands. So that's the idea, again, this authority that comes from God. This is part of the created order, that the husband is the head of his wife. We learn in Ephesians from Paul, the husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head of his church. So there's a connection there. There is a subjection there. And we'll talk about this, but this immediately jumps off the page in the American context as being wicked and evil and misogynistic and all these other things that you will hear, and you've been hearing already for the last several generations now. This has been the mindset of our culture for a long time, and it's only advanced in the years that have gone by. But the letter continues to do just that, to be painful to the American ear. You are God's possession. Slaves are subject to their masters, even if they're cruel. You are subject to your governing authority, even if they're cruel. You are subject to your husband. It all fits together. But the reason has been consistently one and the same. And we see that right here in verse 1. So that what? They may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. It is a gracious thing, going up just a couple verses. It is back into chapter 2 here, chapter 2, verse 20. It is a gracious thing in the sight of God to suffer. That is not what our ears like to hear. It is not the normal thing that we wish to hear. But each time Paul goes this way, Peter goes this way, what does he do? He points to the suffering of Jesus. He's going to do that in this chapter as well. And we'll get to that in verse 18. So the theme is consistent again and again and again. We do everything that we do. We endure whatever life makes us endure in order that our neighbor may know God. That's the point. That's why we're here. I've said it this way before, but there's a reason when you come to faith in Jesus, you don't just poof off of the earth. God put you here for a purpose, to care for his creation, to care for your neighbor. And so we love God, we love our neighbor. We see that consistently in the New Testament as being the purpose, the function of the life of a Christian. And we see it here from Peter as well. Your aim is not yourself. Your aim is that your neighbor would come to know Christ. And so what does Paul go on to say here about this? Well, we saw that idea back in chapter 2, verse 12. You act this way, you love, you act well, you act in a decent manner always in the sight of the Gentiles so that they may come to know Christ. Here it's so your husband may come to know Christ. In the next section, it's going to be so that whoever might be causing you to suffer will come to know Christ. We see it again and again. Verse 3, women are called to not let their adorning, so how they bring attention to themselves, be external. This is like Matthew chapter 6. We are to give in secret. We are to pray in secret. Those kinds of things. We are not to draw attention to ourselves. That is not our aim. That is not our goal. This is a call to be humble. So instead of drawing attention to yourself with your appearance, serve. A person of imperishable beauty, gentle and quiet spirit. That's the person who serves. That's the woman who serves those around her instead of serving and caring for herself, instead of seeking attention for herself. I know many faithful women that are gentle and quiet in spirit, and they are a tremendous blessing that the Lord has given to his church and to their families. They're the kind of people that it's nice to be around, to be quite honest. They're wonderful. I'm thankful for my own wife that God has given to my family as well. And the end of the verse, this is very precious in God's sight. A reminder here, who are we seeking to please? And you can ask that question to your children if you want to today. Who is it that we're seeking to please in life? We're not to please ourselves, which is our sinful nature's desire. We're not really even supposed to please our neighbor necessarily. We're seeking to please the Lord in all that we do and all that we are. Verse 5 brings up the idea of submitting to your husband. Paul gives a picture of that in Ephesians 5, that the wife submits to her husband as the church submits to Christ. And that's a helpful way to picture that word submit as well. And what that means, you entrust yourself to another. So the church entrusts herself to Jesus, that Jesus will care for and provide for all that we need, including our salvation. The wife entrusts herself to her husband, that he will care for her, he will provide for her in this world. Now, there's a bit of a potential slam here from Peter on the current church. And by current, I meant the day he was writing, although it may apply also to us now. This is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, does seem to suggest that the people of Peter's day were not doing this thing. And so that this is an encouragement that they would be doing this. Um, Verse 7 is the direction then to men, to husbands, and to live with your wives, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. There's one that'll get people upset today as well. But it's simply a note of physical strength that one might have. So the man, by nature, by the way God has designed us to be, the man is the stronger of the two. Men are just this way. It's how God designed it. And so statistically, the most recent stats I've seen, the average man has 26 more pounds of muscle on his body than your average woman. And that leads to, I think it was 40% more upper body strength and 33% more lower body strength. This is not to say that women are worthless or to be despised. It actually says the opposite. Men, take care of them. Husbands, you are the protector of your bride. You are to care for them above yourself. Why? Because they are heirs with you of the grace of life. They are co-heirs of Christ. We are not to treat our wives as slaves or whatever. I mean, we're not to treat them terribly. Why? Because they also share in the image of God. They also get to live in paradise with the Lord. They have to stand before God on Judgment Day just as you do to give an account of themselves. Care for your wife, protect her, provide for her, help her to do what God has given her to do. Make that easier for her, not harder. That would be of no benefit to you. The question that we can then, well, I guess real quick, that last note, dishonoring our sisters in Christ, according to Peter here, seems to result in your prayers, men, going unheard before the Lord. Now, what role has God created you for is a conversation to have in the family. So if you have a son, what has God made him to be? What has God created him for? If you have a daughter, what has God made her to be? What has God created her for? And in some ways, those answers overlap and are the same. We both are made to care for creation. We're both made to love God and to love our neighbor. But in other ways, they are not the same. Those roles between men and women don't look identical. Our culture wants to say that they do and is trying so desperately to erase any difference between men and women. But it's simply the truth. It is the truth of God's creation and of what God himself speaks. There are beautiful things that women can do that men cannot do. There are wonderful things that men can do that women cannot do. We are called to these things. Men, sons, God has called you to be leaders of your family. He has called you to care for them and protect them and to lead them to Christ. Women, daughters, God has called you not to an outer beauty, but to a beautiful servant's heart, that you would care for your family, that you would care for your neighbor. These are good things. These are blessings when we do what God has given us to do. And again, there's a lot of overlap there. One of the things that you may end up doing with your sons and daughters here is to take on some of the weaknesses that show up in this. And by that, I guess I should rephrase that. Some of the particular struggles that we end up having from this. So for girls in particular, the struggle could be what most young ladies go through in their lives, which is the struggle with physical appearance. Your physical appearance does not matter in the slightest. I know the world tells you the opposite, but it doesn't. Your value is in Jesus, not in the world, not in what the world adores. That's a hard worldview to shake. But your value is in Christ and in his blood, which he shed for you. He said you're worth something. He said you're worth his own life. That's why you have value. It's the same for guys as well. And for our young men, for boys, you could probably go after the objectification of women on this one. They're not objects for our personal pleasing. That's not what God created women to be. Yes, they were created to be our helpers, but objectifying them does not help them. And it doesn't help them help us either. It's not helpful to us to objectify them. Instead, Peter gives a better picture here that we are to be caring for them and protecting them. So teach your sons, we used to call this chivalry, teach them how to honor women and to do so well and to love them and to care for them. That was probably longer than I wanted to spend there, but it's important stuff to cover. So as we get to the next section here, suffering for righteousness' sake is the subtitle in my Bible. Lots of adjectives here. So unity of mind is both doctrine, but also the purpose for why we live. Sympathy is a great word. That you would suffer with another is literally what the Greek word means. Sum is with, and then pathein is from the verb pasco, which is to suffer. So sympathy is to suffer with someone else, have sympathy with them, suffer together. Uh, Brotherly love was commanded to us back in chapter 1, verse 22. Tender heart's a fun Greek word. It comes from the Greek word for compassion, which is actually the word gut. So your splagna, your guts, those feelings from your gut that you have. Be good gutted is quite literally what the Greek word would say here. But have a compassionate heart is probably the best way to translate that in English. And then humble, not viewing ourselves as being more important than another. Verse 9, don't seek to get even. That's not why we're here. That does not help your neighbor. You are not going to win someone over to Christ. You're not going to get the gospel message shared if you're seeking to avenge yourself. It's not going to happen. So give it up. Give up yourself. Die to yourself. Stop caring about yourself and live for your neighbor. Consistent of the theme here in Peter. Bless your neighbor is another thing here. Instead of cursing them, bless them. That's what we've been called to do. The quote in verse 10 and through 12 is from Psalm 34. Peter is teaching nothing new. These are things that God has said before. Now, verse 13, that paragraph is an excellent one in the church today. There will be those who try to persecute you. You will suffer for righteousness' sake, but if you do, you will be blessed. You are to not fear the person persecuting you. Why not fear them? Because even if they take your life, even if they kill you, you are with Christ forevermore. They're just sending you a little earlier to paradise, and that's not the end of the world. Not even close. It actually ends up being a good thing. Martyrdom is a good thing because it shares the gospel with those people, and that's the point that we're going to see here. Always be prepared in your heart to defend the hope that is in you. This is a verse typically used to discuss apologetics in our era today, the defense of the faith. Those are great topics, great studies, but this is a little more generic than that, a little more general than that, maybe. Or I should say this is a little more specific than that. This is to the idea that when you are suffering, when you are being persecuted, that you would be able in that moment to tell them why you still have hope. Why aren't you afraid? They're beating you. They've imprisoned you. They're leading you off to be executed. Why aren't you terrified? Why aren't you groveling? Why aren't you begging them to let you go? What hope do you have? Be prepared. Be prepared to make the statement that you have of faith in Jesus Christ and what he has promised to give you that can never be taken from you. That's the goal. Why? Verse 16, so that, again, this is for the sake of the neighbor, that those who revile you in Christ will be put to shame. That is, that their way of life will be defeated, that they will be proved to be worthless in how they live, and that will bring others to then see the value of Christ in their life and have that faith come upon them. And then again, this is one when Peter talks about how we suffer in this letter, he always points it to Jesus. Verse 18, Christ also suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. So Jesus, the only righteous one, suffered for all the unrighteous in the world. Now you have the righteousness of Christ, and you suffer for the ones who are still unrighteous, who are still separated from Christ. That's the aim here, that he might bring us to God, that you might bring them to God. Do you see the connection? Do you see what Peter's doing in the text here? Wonderful stuff. And so with verse 19 is terribly confusing and has caused no lack of a amount of conflict in the ages of the church. But focus on the connection of 19 to what we were just saying, to the point Peter's making. Jesus spoke to those imprisoned. You are now speaking to those imprisoned in darkness in this world. I think the best we can understand of verse 19 is that Jesus proclaimed what? He proclaimed his victory. So even if we're talking about his descent into hell after his death on the cross, he didn't go necessarily to hell to bring people out of hell. He went to proclaim his victory. That the futile way of living, the shameful way of living mentioned in verse 16 has been put to an end. Christ is victorious. Verse 20 gets into the idea of Noah, who also, like verse 15, was giving the hope that he had to his neighbors, but none of them wanted to board the ark. None of them believed God. None of them trusted. Verse 21, baptism now saves you. This is a great verse for helping to show other people that baptism is not our work, but is something that God does for us. Baptism is a sacrament of the church. It is something God uses to save us, and we're thankful for that. If you have questions on baptism, again, let me know. Be happy to talk about it. We've run a little long today, but there was a lot in this chapter to unpack. It'll get a little tighter tomorrow with chapter 4. The Lord's blessing be with you.